Right, well, good evening, everybody. We'll make a start. I'm delighted to welcome tonight's speaker, Professor Simon Morgan. Simon is head of history at Leeds Beckett University, and he specialises in 19th century British history, with particular reference to the histories of radical politics, gender, and celebrity. He's going to talk to us tonight about Richard Cobden. The title of his lecture is A Manchester Man Abroad, Richard Cobden and the West Riding. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Simon.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to talk. It's a great pleasure. It's a long time since I talked to the Thoresby Society, so it's good to be back. For those of you who don't know much about Richard Cobden, and I'm afraid that by the time I was at school in the 1980s, the days when every schoolboy learnt about Cobden and Bright were long gone. But for those of you who don't know who he is, if I can, so for those of you who don't know who Cobden is, just a very quick introduction to him. He was the son of a Sussex farmer who became a Manchester manufacturer in the 1820s, and he actually took the sobriquet of a Manchester manufacturer for the when he published his first political pamphlets in the 1830s. He stood unsuccessfully for the borough of Stockport in 1837 in Cheshire, and then successfully won the representation of the borough in 1841 and remained there until 1847, when he actually became one of the MPs for the West Riding of Yorkshire, which he remained until 1857, when he stepped down to contest Huddersfield unsuccessfully in that year. He then spent a couple of years out of Parliament before being returned for Rochdale in 1859. And Cobden was known as one of the great heroes of early liberalism in the 19th century, and Cobdenism, which was his kind of political economy policies, if you like, that were based around freedom of trade, non-intervention in foreign affairs, and the reduction in expenditure on armaments, became one of the sort of guiding principles of the Liberal Party, and remained so up until the Second World War. And indeed, it also had an influence on Labour Party economic policy as well, and international policy between the wars. He was an active citizen and campaigner. He first got involved in the campaign for education, but he's most famous for being the leader of the Anti-Corn Law League, which was founded in early 1839 to get rid of the Corn Laws, the raft of duties on imported grain and other foodstuffs that had been ratcheted up after the Napoleonic Wars in order to protect British farming from competition from the continent at a time when, at the end of the Napoleonic blockade of Britain, there was a danger of Britain being swamped by cheap food imports from abroad to the detriment of British farmers. But the Anti-Corn Law League, of course, believed that the Corn Laws were, first of all, designed primarily to line the pockets of the landowners at the expense of all other classes, particularly the urban industrial classes, and also were a restraint on trade, because by putting high tariffs on food imports from other countries, those countries were retaliating by tariffs on British manufacturers and denying Britain vital markets overseas. But as well as the Anti-Corn Law campaign, he actually had a finger in many other pies. I mentioned education. He was also interested in electoral reform, the freedom of the press. He was a leading figure of the international peace movement. And in fact, Cobden believed in freedom of trade, not merely to generate more profits for British business, but primarily actually as a way of achieving international peace by encouraging trade between nations. Because if you trade with nations, in theory at least, you won't be fighting wars with those nations. Germany was Britain's biggest export partner in 1914, though, so that kind of more or less kiboshes that theory. That's basically the theory. He was also an anti-imperialist, and he negotiated in 1860 a commercial treaty with France, which became the cornerstone of a network of treaties that created one of the biggest or if not the biggest, peacefully achieved free trade zone in Europe before the European Economic Community was created in the second half of the 20th century. And he was also known as the friend of America alongside his co-worker John Bright during the American Civil War. So I just wanted to tell you, first of all, a little bit about how I got involved in Richard Cobden, or how he got involved with me. In 2002, I got my first full-time academic post working on the Letters of Richard Cobden project at the London School of Economics under Anthony Howe. And our remit was to produce a complete edition of Cobden's letters, which we estimated at that time at around 3,000 extant letters. In the event, we found about 7,500 letters. We were given some duff information by West Sussex Record Office, who told us that all the letters they had were copies of what was in the British Library. And that partly was true, but actually a lot of those copies were of letters that now no longer existed. So the copies were unique. And they also had a huge stash that they'd just forgotten to tell us about of original letters. We found many more than we thought. And Oxford University Press basically, when their kind of editor recovered from their swoon, refused to publish that many. So we brought out 4 selected volumes of Cobden's letters, representing, I think, roughly just over a fifth, I think, of the total output. So that left us with quite a lot of transcripts that we didn't know what to do with, or rather we knew what to do with them, but we didn't know how to do it and how to fund it. So eventually we managed to get some follow-on funding. Tony Howard by this time had retired, so I became the principal investigator on the project, and we created this, the Letters of Richard Cobden online. And there are 5,500 Cobden transcripts on that. It's completely free to access. It's a little bit rough and ready around the edges because it's not as fully annotated as the published editions are. We're working on that. But yeah, you can go and have a look there. There are teaching materials as well for citizenship classes at Key Stage 3. And there are also explanatory essays, etc., etc. So it's a wonderful resource for teachers and historians and the general public alike. But back to the kind of main theme of my talk today, which is Cobden and the West Riding of Yorkshire. In 1877, a statue of Cobden was unveiled in Bradford, and this is it, resplendent in the Bradford Wool Exchange, otherwise known as Waterstones, in Bradford. And John Bright, Cobden's colleague for many years, came to give an address at its unveiling. But Bright's speech makes hardly any mention of the fact that Cobden was the representative of the West Riding for 10 years in the 1840s and 50s. And, this statue is unique on this side of the Pennines. There were already 2 other statues west of the Pennines in Salford and Manchester, soon to be joined by one in Stockport. But there was no real sort of talk of Cobden's connection. Those other statues had been funded by public subscription, but this one was actually the gift of an American manufacturer called George Henry Booth, a stuff merchant and partner in a Bradford firm. And his intention by producing this or providing this statue was not to honour Cobden's connection with the West Riding, still less as the Bradford Peace Museum has it, because Cobden lived and worked in Bradford, which is complete nonsense. One of their leaflets. But because Booth wanted to honour Cobden's contribution to Anglo-American peace during the Civil War period. So this seeming indifference to Cobden in West Yorkshire is indicative of the tensions that existed between the county and its sometime representatives. So what I'm going to do today is explore that relationship in detail to see where the fault lines lay. And also in the process to shed light on the broader difficulty facing Cobden's project of creating a middle-class party, capitalising on the repeal of the Corn Laws by doing away with the kind of connection between the sort of Whigs and Liberals, the aristocrats and the urban radicals, and creating a very much middle-class-led party that was independent of the aristocracy. So I'm going to start by looking at the anti-Corn Law period, Cobden's connection with the West Riding during the anti-Corn Law campaign, and then going to move on to the period when he was the MP for the West Riding. And if I have time, I might sneak in a little coda about what happens afterwards, and particularly Cobden's relationship with another great West Riding radical MP, William Edward Foster, who I'm sure you all have heard of. To begin with, I should note that the convoluted issues around Liberal politics in the West Riding of Yorkshire have been explored in depth in two articles, one by FML Thompson and the other by Derek Fraser. Thompson explored the internecine conflicts in the riding in terms of a split between the urban Liberals, led by Edward Baines Jr. of the Leeds Mercury, and the county Whigs, personified by Earl Fitzwilliam. Fraser, on the other hand, focuses on the issue of voluntary education, the dogmatic pursuit of which split the urban Liberals between the voluntaries, led by Baines on the one hand, and those who believed, with Cobden, in a system of publicly funded national education, which was led by Unitarians like Hamish Stansfeld and James Garth Marshall. So in these accounts, Cobden has something of a cameo role. So I'm going to kind of put him back towards the centre, really. But even before all that, I just want to tell you a little bit about Cobden's connection with Yorkshire before he became involved in politics. And it wasn't initially a very happy one. In 1814, the Cobdens had basically had to leave their ancestral farmhouse and had then sort of pretty much given up on the land after trying to make a go of a second farm. And Cobden had been packed off to school at Bowes, which was then in North Yorkshire. It's now in County Durham. And Cobden, I don't think, perhaps realised that Bowes was the kind of inspiration for Charles Dickens when he was writing Nicholas Nickleby, and the kind of portrait of Do the Boys Hall was based on some of those schools in Bowes, where the kind of unwanted sons of poor middle-class families were kind of packed off for a dirt cheap education. And Dickens, of course, was inspired by seeing the graves of many of those scholars in the local churchyard. And actually, Wackford Squeers, the original of that character, had been a master at Bowes Hall, where Cobden was, before going off to found his own school, Bowes Academy. So his time there, his first encounter with Yorkshire was pretty miserable. He ends up going back there, though, in the 1820s, by which time he is a commercial traveller for his uncle's calico distribution firm in London. And he embarks on this odyssey across the British Isles, up through the Midlands, across into Lancashire, then across to Ireland, from Dublin to Belfast, then to Scotland. And then he comes back, having done all the Scottish towns, he comes back down to York, then to Hull, then across to Leeds and Bradford, and then back across the Pennines again to Lancashire before ending up in London. So this is where he starts to become familiar with the manufacturing districts. And it's during this period as a commercial traveller that he hatches the plan to start up on his own account with some like-minded individuals. But let's, skipping forward to the Free Trade Movement, the Anti-Corn Law League. This begins as a Manchester movement with the foundation of the Manchester Anti-Corn Law Association in 1838. But when it becomes apparent that the Whig government of the day are not going to be easily pushed into repealing the Corn Laws, the Anti-Corn Law League is founded as a way of kind of federating all of the different free trade associations that are starting to spring up in different parts of the country. And naturally, the West Riding of Yorkshire becomes a centre of interest because there are a lot of manufacturers here, a lot of working class mill workers, and so on and so forth. Exactly the kind of constituency that the League is trying to mobilise west of the Pennines. And of course, there's an awful lot of wealth as well to mobilise behind this campaign. However, the West Riding, and Leeds in particular, was a big disappointment in terms of raising money and interest. In the early days of the League campaign, Cobden was his principal correspondent in the West Riding seems to have been Samuel Smiles, doctor, author, social reformer, secretary of the Leeds Parliamentary Reform Association, and editor of the radical Leeds Times newspaper. Of course, he eventually becomes very famous as the author of Self-Help in 1859, that sort of great text of Victorian individualism. And Cobden was very impressed with Smiles's running of the Leeds Times. He contrasted it very favourably with its Manchester namesake, run by Archibald Prentice, and he saw Smiles as a very gifted journalist in this way. And his letters to Smiles focus on the challenges to a very fragile young movement, particularly in the years 1841 to 1842. First, that challenge of keeping all of the different regional anti-corn law associations focused on the main task, and particularly on the call for total and immediate repeal of the corn laws, instead of being seduced by compromise measures that the Whig government were putting forward, like a fixed duty on corn instead of the sliding scale that existed. The second issue was that the necessity, really, or as the League saw it at the time, of mobilising the working class behind the League at a time when many of them were supporting the Chartist movement, and the Chartists were hostile to the League. They believed in repealing the corn laws to make bread cheaper, but they thought that if it was done at the behest of the manufacturers, all that would happen is the manufacturers would lower wages after the price of corn had come down. Smiles, of course, was a great believer in trying to bring the League campaign together with the Chartists, and he founded or helped found an organisation called the sort of Household Suffrage Association that tried to bring the more moderate Chartists together with the middle class reformers. But Cobden was a bit horrified by this, partly because he wanted to keep the Chartists at arm's length. He didn't like Fergus O'Connor, who he thought was a radical demagogue. But he also thought that this was a distraction from the main purpose of the League, which was to get rid of the tax on corn. So a lot of his letters to Smiles are sort of admonishing him about spending too much time on this. At the same time, though, Cobden did want to create something of a mass movement. He wanted, at this stage, to get the working classes involved. Now, he wrote a letter to Smiles in August 1841, where he talks about this. How stands Leeds? Have the corn law repealers such an influence that you could join in a unanimous demonstration at a public meeting against the bread tax without interference from Chartists or Tories? We are in that position here, and unless the other large towns can be worked into the same state, we shall not be able to take advantage of the chapter of accidents during the ensuing parliamentary campaign or in the event of a bad harvest. We can hope nothing from Parliament unless influenced from without, which is a good illustration of the way Cobden saw the role of the League working to put pressure on Parliament to pass reform, and that this could be done most effectually at a time of some kind of crisis, like a poor harvest, for example. And he then reaches a rousing climax. I like this letter because it kind of shows Cobden at his kind of chivying best. The whole matter lies in a single inquiry. Can we unite with the people around us? If not, the game is up, and we deserve no pity if the fate of the house divided against itself falls upon us. If we do unite amongst ourselves now, I think circumstances are conspiring to lead us on to speedy victory. By the autumn, though, Cobden was pretty much in despair of the state in the West Riding. Nothing is more untoward than your present state in Leeds. You are broken into sections, waging war against each other. So the failure of Smiles's household suffrage movement, which was ridiculed in the Chartist Northern Star as the Fox and Goose Club, with the middle-class radicals characterised as the Foxes, there with Daniel O'Connell as the central figure, and Hamish Stansfeld and James Garth Marshall on either side. And the Geese, of course, those working class men and women foolish enough to fall for their wiles going along. So this kind of puts an end, really, to the household suffrage movement. By December 1842, Smiles himself was getting fed up and wanting to leave Leeds for pastures new. And he actually writes to Cobden asking whether there might be an opening for him as a journalist editing a free trade newspaper in Manchester. And Cobden, although he thought that Smiles was the better journalist than Prentice, had to sort of say, well, actually, we owe Prentice a lot. He's really sort of been a stalwart supporter, so we can't really upset the apple cart in that way. So, thinking about the Whigs versus the Liberals, so I can move that up so we can see. Yeah, so a letter dated October 1842 from Cobden to Edward Baines, the editor of the Leeds Mercury, of course, one of the Leeds Times' rival papers, shows that from this point onwards, Cobden was to rely on promoting the cause through that newspaper. And this reflected two things, not just sort of Smiles' withdrawal from the field, but it also reflected a change in the policy of the Mercury itself. The Mercury had been supportive earlier on of kind of Whig compromises. Now it moved to a much more sort of hardline free trade stance. So Cobden was eager to make use of that, but also to encourage it further. By the time he wrote to Baines in March 1843, Baines had brought the Mercury out definitively against a fixed duty in a series of letters addressed to Lord John Russell, who was the leader of the opposition. The Whigs were in opposition by this stage, of course, because Peel had come in with the Conservatives in 1841. So, in the March letter, Cobden asked Baines to write a manifesto from the free traders of the North that there can be no compromise of the principles of free trade and that the League cannot be used for political objects. Now, Baines was the perfect vehicle for such an address. And it was therefore, he was the editor of first of all, of the most widely circulated provincial newspaper in early Victorian Britain, certainly in the north of England, with circulation way beyond Leeds itself, across the West Riding and into Lancashire. So it was easy to cast him as the kind of mouthpiece of the North, or easier at least to do that than it was for any other journalist. There was also a tactical value in this message coming from Leeds rather than Manchester. It shows that this is a genuinely widespread movement, not just something that is focused on Manchester itself. But although the secession of Leeds free traders and they're kind of getting mixed up with Chartists was no longer the risk it was when Smiles had been around, the real enemy remained the apathy of the Leeds manufacturers and shopkeepers. Leeds failed to contribute to the Great League funds to the same extent as other major towns. In fact, even in the West Riding, it lagged behind. It wasn't until sort of about 1844 that their contributions outstripped that of Huddersfield, for example. And Baines recognised Cobden as the mainspring of the movement, and he complained that Cobden would need to send over some Manchester men to impart some of their fire to the campaign on this side of the Pennines. Now, from 1844 to 45, the League shifts its attention. It's no longer so interested in recruiting the non-electors, the working classes, to a mass movement. It's very much starting to focus down on mobilising the electors to put electoral pressure on the two established parties, the Whigs and the Conservatives. So it starts a registration campaign, which was quite aggressive. It was about not just registering new voters who were going to vote for free trade candidates. It was also about deregistering voters who were registered to vote, who were known to be voters for Whigs and Conservatives, and who weren't going to go their way on free trade. And the means by which new voters were going to be manufactured was also quite aggressive, in the sense that the freehold land societies came into existence that eventually become related to the ancestors of the Abbey National Building Society, as it then becomes, which eventually gets absorbed by Santander, I think. But the freehold land societies begin with this attempt to create 40-shilling freeholders in key constituencies, people who own enough land to qualify for a 40-shilling freehold vote, and therefore can tip the balance in county elections. We'll come back to that in a bit. So, as the Baines-Cobden correspondence shows, Leeds also, though, lagged behind in registration, just as much as it did in fundraising. And the problem for Baines was that the registration machinery of the local party was largely in the hands of the agents of Earl Fitzwilliam, the leading Whig grandee. Fitzwilliam resented any external interference in the riding, which he seems to have regarded, if not quite as a personal fiefdom, then at least as some kind of joint stock enterprise in which he had one of the controlling shares. Fitzwilliam himself was a moderate free trader. He'd written a pamphlet against the Corn Laws, but in the face of League pressure, he increasingly begins to put class interest before his political principle, although it took a little time for that to become apparent. Now, initially, Cobden was optimistic. When the League switches to registration in 1844, he writes to Baines saying he found no estrangement from the Liberal cause on account of the League's proceedings, nor would the landed proprietors dislike to see the Leaguers in the towns take up the registration and work it for the next revision. However, the results of that revision were disappointing. On the 11th of October, Cobden wrote, "We must either induce Lord Fitzwilliam and his party to coalesce cordially with us, or else abandon all hopes of your important division being rescued from the monopolists." So at this point, Cobden still sees alliance with the Whig grandees as at least desirable, if not absolutely necessary. But by the following week, after he'd talked to Edward Newman, who was Fitzwilliam's agent, Cobden was telling Baines, "Unless the Whig squires will join the towns heartily, you would be better without their half-hearted fellowship," and pointed to the Liberals' success in throwing over the Whigs in South Lancashire. In March 1845, he wrote, "The Whig proprietors want to absorb you, or at least to control you. You must set up for yourselves as free traders, and all that is worth having of the landed party will join you." But Baines still clung to the hope that the West Riding alliance with the Whigs could be reconstructed. As Derek Fraser points out, in the end, all he could do was minimise the publicity of the League's revision of the registers, and the fact that hundreds of new West Riding votes were being created through the 40-shilling freehold campaign, many of them belonging to voters resident in Lancashire. Oops, not too far. So, after the repeal of the Corn Laws in June 1846, Cobden set off on an extended tour of continental Europe as the apostle of free trade. He left strict instructions behind him that in the event of the general election that now seemed inevitable following the fall of Peel after the Conservative Party split over repeal, he was to stay in his small, comfortable and safe seat at Stockport. And he was therefore entirely furious when in 1847, still on his tour, he found that he'd been elected as one of the 2 MPs for the West Riding of Yorkshire, one of the largest and most populous constituencies in England. So how had this come about? Well, on the one hand, guilt seems to have played quite a substantial role. Cobden's Manchester friends, particularly Bright, felt guilty that Bright had been elected as MP for Manchester. Many people felt that that was the seat that Cobden deserved. And actually, Bright had driven Cobden mad about it while he'd been on tour, writing letters about whether, are you quite sure that you're happy for me to go for this? Yes, just get elected for Manchester. There was also guilt, though, on the part of Baines and the West Riding Liberals, because, as I mentioned earlier, the region had not quite pulled its weight during the campaign itself. So they thought they could make up for this by having a triumphal return of Cobden as their MP. And of course, there was precedent for great popular causes to be represented by MPs for Yorkshire or for the West Riding of Yorkshire. So, Wilberforce being elected after the slave trade campaign. You had Lord Brougham being elected after the kind of Reform Act. So there's all of these sorts of kind of precedents. So being elected to the West Riding of Yorkshire was a great honour, and it's an important division. So Cobden felt, although he resented it bitterly, that he had no option but to accept the nomination, and he'll, in the process, gaining a rather unfair reputation in Stockport as a bit of a carpetbagger. However, he could at least console himself with the idea that had formed in his mind towards the end of the anti-Corn Law campaign, that of forging a new House of Commons party solely representative of the industrious classes and independent of the aristocracy. And in June 1846, he writes an extraordinary letter, with the Corn Law repeal seemingly in the bag. He writes an extraordinary letter to Robert Peel, basically asking him to put himself, as the most popular politician in the country at that moment, to put himself at the head of this new middle class party, get rid of the aristocrats from the Tories and from the Whigs, and put yourself at the head of this new party. Now, it would have been interesting to be a fly on the wall when Peel read this letter, because that was precisely the outcome that he'd been trying to avoid by repealing the Corn Laws in the first place. He wanted to remove the big bone of contention between the aristocrats and the middle classes, so that they could, present a united front in the face of threats from lower down the social scale. But Yorkshire offered Cobden an opportunity to build grassroots support for this entity. The platform was to be a moderately radical combination of parliamentary and financial reform. The former set out in the so-called Little Charter put forward by Joseph Hume in April 1848, which the Chartists, of course, had their famous 6 points. Hume had 4: household suffrage instead of universal, secret ballot, which is the same, triennial parliaments instead of annual parliaments, and equal electoral districts. The financial part was summarised in Cobden's People's Budget of 1849, which would return government expenditure to 1835 levels through cuts in military expenditure, which of course was the largest slice of the budget in the 1840s. In a letter to Bright, Cobden set the difficulties of the riding in this broader context. Unless they could count on significant electoral support, the Whigs could marginalise the independent Liberals in the Commons. We've made great progress in this direction in Lancashire, Scotland and the metropolis, but the greatest blow to Whig tactics would be to break up the so-called Liberal Party in the West Riding. This can never be done until Baines is converted to our ranks. By the time that Lord Morpeth succeeded the Earl of Carlisle in 1848, triggering a by-election for the vacant West Riding seat, the Whigs had indeed split with the Liberals, with Fitzwilliam first trying to foist his own son onto the constituency before openly emerging in support of the Tory candidate. Moreover, the Liberal Party, the Urban Liberal Party, began to implode under the pressure of Baines's militant support for the voluntary education campaign. Hopelessly divided, the Liberals were unable to prevent the return of the Tory as the second MP. Cobden informed Baines that he saw the result as notice to quit the riding, and urged him to turn his newspaper to questions of political economy as the only way to build a broader political platform. Early in 1849, bear in mind he was elected in 1847, okay, he didn't get back to the country until September, he still hadn't officially been welcomed into the constituency. And the problem was compounded by the fact that he was now relocating from Lancashire to his native Sussex. He'd used part of the national testimonial raised to him in 1846 to repurchase the ancestral farmhouse at Hayshot near Midhurst. So his time was now largely divided between Sussex and London, and his opportunities for heading north were pretty limited. Now, eventually, a banquet was put on to welcome Cobden back, into his new constituency, which took place at Wakefield on the 11th of April, 1849. And it was followed on the 12th with a financial reform meeting in Leeds. In December, Cobden was back with a reform meeting at Leeds at which Marshall and Baines also spoke. So this is the start of a long process of reconstructing the Liberal Party in the West Riding. The arrival of a protectionist Conservative ministry in 1852 focused minds, and even though Fitzwilliam remained, quote, as eccentric as ever, Cobden agreed to contest the riding again to prevent this influential seat falling to a protectionist. But Cobden was aware he was living on borrowed time in the riding, and he stated that he would not stand again. His relationship with Baines continued to be problematic, as the two were openly at odds now over education. Cobden was increasingly identified with the latest initiatives in Manchester, which got around the religious problem by advocating secular education and campaigned for permissive legislation. And he got exasperated because Baines continued to act and talk as if the kind of centralised government scheme was the only one on the table.
Small things seem to add up.
In October 1853, Cobden gave an important speech at the Barnsley Mechanics Institute. Because remember, this is the West Riding, so most of what is now South Yorkshire was in the West Riding of Yorkshire, making the case that there were insufficient school places under the voluntary system, a fact that was definitively established by the Taunton Commission in the 1860s, which was particularly scathing of the efforts of the Leeds dissenters. They focused their attentions on, because Baines had made all the fuss, they thought they'd make an example of it. So this kind of wins the argument eventually, of course, for national education, as we'll see. Nonetheless, there was still some common ground between Baines and Cobden, and it was on the grounds of peace. Both of them believed in free trade as promoting, international peace, and that peace was great because it meant you could cut government expenditure, and it was also good in itself for trade. But unfortunately, in 1854, Britain and France went to war with Russia over the Crimea. This after, Cobden and Baines have been great friends in 1853 when there'd been one of the sort of periodic invasion panics that swept the country after Napoleon's nephew, Napoleon III, became president and then emperor of France. So they were making sort of plans to kind of combat this, and Baines was supporting Cobden. But then the following year, the Crimean War breaks out, and a lot of liberals supported the Crimean War because they thought this is a chance to get at Russia. Russia had crushed the national movements, the national liberation movements in Poland and Hungary and elsewhere in 1848-9 during the 1848 revolutions. So a chance to get back at Russia for crushing these sort of liberal revolutions on the continent. So that sort of divides the Liberal Party, and it sets Baines and Cobden at loggerheads on this issue as well. So Cobden, firm believer in non-intervention, suddenly finds himself isolated, not just from the sectarian Bainesites, but from most of his liberal sympathisers in the riding as well. And this becomes painfully apparent in January 1855, when Cobden attends a peace meeting in Leeds and is defeated. And feeling is running high. Before the meeting takes place, the mayor, Joshua Richardson, himself a Quaker pacifist and a member of the Peace Society, orders that Peace Society placards around the town be torn down in order to preserve the public peace. Cobden himself, though, gets a surprisingly good reception. In fact, he writes back to his wife that he's cheered through the streets because the people admired his courage in actually turning up in the first place. So it didn't end badly for him on a personal level. But again, it underlines the fact that his political support in the riding is now at a low ebb. So in 1857, he decides instead to stand for Huddersfield, where he had a good friend in the German merchant Frederick Schwann. But having been badly advised by over-optimistic supporters, he was soon staring at defeat. And you can see just how far the free trade consensus in Northern England is shattered by this point, by the fact that the person who beats him at Huddersfield is Edward Ackroyd, who had also been an anti-Corn Law Leaguer in the 1840s, and another liberal. So Cobden was a casualty of his own opposition to the Crimean War and the defeat that he'd inflicted on Lord Palmerston through a motion he'd tabled condemning the Navy's bombardment of Canton, which had triggered the 1857 election in the first place. The Manchester School, of which he was seen as the head, was routed. Cobden himself had canvassed unsuccessfully in Manchester on Bright's behalf. Bright was incapacitated by a mental breakdown at this point. And this was the kind of nadir of the Manchester School's fortunes. And it finally puts paid to Cobden's dream of a middle-class Liberal Party, independent of the aristocracy. You could argue that this vision eventually is realised by Gladstone, but that's almost by default because of the hemorrhaging of aristocratic support from the Liberal Party in the 1870s and particularly the 1880s due to Gladstone's views on Home Rule. Moreover, it left Cobden disillusioned with the middle classes, who he'd always seen as the motors of progressive reform, and particularly with those like Baines, who insisted on clinging to the coattails of the Whig aristocracy. As Cobden had observed to Bright in 1848, had Baines not been bred a dissenter, he must have been a very moderate Whig. So when it came to reconstructing the Liberal Party in the West Riding in the 1850s, it shouldn't be surprising that Baines should turn back to the aristocratic Whigs rather than the more radical interloper from the other side of the Pennines. Now, I've spent a lot of time talking about politics. What I want to do for a few minutes is just to talk about Cobden's everyday constituency business in the West Riding of Yorkshire. We don't have a lot of Cobden's correspondence with ordinary constituents, but we have a little more for the West Riding than we do for his other seats, partly because his other seats were pretty much looked after for him by local agents, whereas the West Riding was so sprawling and the local party, as we've heard, so fractured that he probably ended up doing more of the business himself. One of the important things that local representatives did in the 19th century was to help steer local bills through Parliament. A lot of parliamentary business was local business. You had to have an Act of Parliament to pretty much do anything in the 19th century. So one of my favourite letters to a constituent was one that he received in April 1852 from a retired clergyman who lived in the vicinity of Ilkley Moor. And the letter reads thus. It's a very simple letter. The Ilkley, it's not the one on the screen. The Ilkley water bill was read a third time in the House of Commons yesterday. Should you wish to effect any alteration in the bill, you will, of course, take an early opportunity of representing your views to a member of the upper house. In other words, you've missed the boat, mate. You need to write to a lord because it's already out of my hands. Now, this letter was referring to a bill going through Parliament establishing the Ilkley Waterworks, which with the intention of improving the town's inadequate water supply. And in the 1840s, the clergyman in question had written to a parliamentary inquiry concerning an earlier scheme of extraction of water from Ilkley Moor. And it seems he was primarily concerned that this extraction was going to occur without what he considered to be the proper compensation to the landowner, which was presumably himself. So seldom can a Church of England minister have been so aptly named as the Reverend Charles Bristow Drought. Another of my favourite constituency letters is the one you can see on the screen, which is from the Thoresby's own collection. And it's also featured in the virtual exhibition, which is another feature of the Cobden site, which brings together about 70 archives worldwide who've contributed images of letters in their possession. And it's to Benjamin Wilson Jr., author of A History of Bramley, and it relates to a petition against an increase in government expenditure on armaments. And this illustrates the second role of the local constituency MP, which was to present petitions to Parliament. Petitioning was a great sort of business, if you like, in the 19th century. The League itself, of course, had helped to hone the machinery of petitioning, as had the Chartist movement, as had the anti-slavery movement before them. So presenting petitions was one of the jobs. Sometimes, of course, the petitions are not things that an MP might be particularly happy with, but on this occasion, this is chiming with Cobden's peace ideals, so I'm sure he was perfectly happy to present this one. But the reason it's one of my favourite letters is because I was actually there when it was discovered. I was in the building at Claremont when the Thoresby Society was still based there, and I was actually doing some work on the Heaton family of Leeds downstairs in the Yorkshire Archaeological Society, and somebody very excitedly came running down the stairs. Is Simon Morgan still in the building? Because we've just found a letter from Richard Cobden, which was fantastic. So they gave me this wonderful photocopy of it, and now it's up on the Cobden website as well, with permission of the society, of course. I think I've got a few minutes on just to kind of think about the what happens after Cobden ceases to be the representative of the West Riding of Yorkshire. So there is a coda to his connection, and it involves a younger radical politician from Bradford called William Edward Foster. Foster began his political career in the 1840s, famously, of course, toured Ireland during the famine with his father. And in 1848, he followed or tried to follow in the footsteps of Samuel Smiles and Hamish Stansfeld in unsuccessfully trying to bring together the middle-class radicals with the Chartists. In 1857, he tried to obtain the nomination to represent Leeds in Parliament, but like Cobden, he was stymied by his disagreement with Edward Baines Jr., the other Liberal candidate, over state education. But by 1859, the political landscape had changed sufficiently for the two men to stand together, but Foster was still defeated. In 1861, though, he was returned at a by-election in Bradford. Now, Cobden had naturally been aware of Foster's earlier activities, and in 1856 he wrote a lukewarm assessment of him to Joseph Sturge, the Quaker peace campaigner. "I can't help you in Yorkshire to any names. Foster is very acute and clever, but one of those speculative, sceptical minds that revolve in their own eccentric orbit, and are very apt to jostle occasionally with other people who pursue the trodden path. I don't think you will ever see him very active or useful in any work that requires plodding perseverance, and where it is necessary to give and take on details in order to cooperate on essentials." An inaccurate prophecy, of course, given Foster's success with the Education Act, which required just such give and take. He will generally be found beset with difficulties on the minor points, which he contrives to magnify into matters of importance. He is, however, a man of most generous impulses, but too impulsive. Now, as we've seen, Cobden lost the Huddersfield election of 1857, but in 1859 he was returned, again in absentia. He was actually on the tour in America at this time, as MP for Rochdale. And his association with Foster during the period from 1861 to his death in 1865 centred on their joint efforts alongside John Bright to prevent the British government's recognition of the South as an independent belligerent state during the American Civil War, or any direct intervention by Britain in that conflict. And after 4 years of observing Foster in the House of Commons, Cobden wrote a more positive assessment to Sir Lewis Mallet of the Board of Trade, while complaining about the Leeds Liberal Association's invitation to Viscount Amberley to represent the town in Parliament, which he saw as epitomising the continued failure of the West Riding Liberals to throw over the landed gentry. "I despair when I see the Leeds Liberals prostrate themselves before that youthful lord and ask him to represent their interests in Parliament. And this for the chief town of the West Riding, the capital of the clothiers. It's enough to make one ashamed of his order. I've said some strong things to Foster about this, and perhaps he may let some of his Leeds friends know what I think of their coo-tooing to this sprig of feudalism. But it is useless. You cannot make people stand upright if they have no backbone, and it is beyond the power of surgery to supply that anatomical defect. Our friend Foster is the best man the manufacturers have sent up from their own class after Bright. He has House of Commons powers, and better far, he has a conscience." In an earlier letter, Cobden had told Foster that the only political speeches he now read as a rule were his and Bright's. For his part, Foster was a warm admirer of Cobden, and he told an audience at Bradford in January 1865 that all men in Europe owe him a far greater debt than we had supposed. The services that he has rendered to civilization by procuring the Treaty of Commerce between us and France in 1860, and thereby setting all European courts and European countries to consider whether they ought not to establish the principles of free trade, is really, I believe, almost as great a service to humanity as that other great service which he did in advocating the abolition of the Corn Laws, which is followed by applause. But sadly, there was little time for Cobden to render further service, or indeed to aid Foster in his great work of educational reform, the first cause that Cobden had taken up in public life in the 1830s. Having struggled through the winter of 1864 to 65 with an acute respiratory complaint, he returned to London in late March to take part in a debate on the defence of Canada. And he died there at his lodgings in Suffolk Street off Pall Mall on the 2nd of April. Thank you very much for your attention.
Questions or observations?
Oh, I think Kevin just got there first.
Yeah, well, it's a question about Cobden's background, in the sense that what were his financial needs through all this period of hectic activity?
Well, Cobden, as I said, goes into business in Lancashire as first of all as a calico distributor, and then eventually as a manufacturer in his own right. They go into partnership. He and his partners go into partnership with Fort Brothers as distributors, and then eventually take over their calico printing works in Chorley and Sabden. And it becomes very successful. It does make an awful lot of money. Anthony Howe has done quite a lot of work on the kind of Cobden finances, as it were, in this period, and he was able to take enough money out of the business to, first of all, purchase a very nice Georgian townhouse on Quay Street in Manchester, which is still known as the Cobden House Chambers. In fact, I used to run when I was at Leicester many years ago. I did a module on Cobden and British liberalism, and we always used to have a field trip to Manchester, which finished up in Cobden's wine cellar, having a glass of wine with one of the barristers who was a bit of a sort of history buff and knew all about that. Yeah, so the business was doing very well. Of course, he then devotes his time to Corn Law Repeal, and he leaves his brother Fred, who was amiable and extremely knowledgeable and entirely useless at business. And by the time you come to the summer of 1845, the business is pretty much on its knees. Cobden has to be sort of clandestinely bailed out by a number of his Manchester friends in order to keep it kind of staggering on. There's a very real danger in 1845 that Cobden was not going to be able to continue with the campaign. And fortunately he does. And then, of course, you have the onset of the Irish famine and the public conversion of Peel to Corn Law Repeal, which follows on from the public conversion of Lord John Russell, the leader of the Whig opposition. So the Corn Law Repeal is then successful almost at the 11th hour as far as Cobden is concerned. But he's bankrupt, pretty much. So this huge national testimonial is raised in his favour, which comes to the tune of £77,000. It's the biggest single testimonial to an individual person that is raised across the whole of the 19th century. Now, a few years ago, Donald Reid wrote a book about Cobden and Bright, a Victorian partnership, which kind of points out that the fact that every schoolboy knew the names of Cobden and Bright as the leaders of the Anti-Corn Law League was erroneous. The fact that in the 1840s, Cobden was definitely the senior person. He was the leader. Bright was a very able orator. He was kind of one of Cobden's trusted lieutenants. But it was Cobden who was the kind of the guiding genius of it all. And I think people knew that at the time. So although Bright was known, Cobden gets £77,000 when the Corn Laws are repealed, and Bright gets a bookcase, which you can actually see in the Touchstones Centre in Rochdale. They have the bookcase with its nice little sort of scrolls of kind of sheaves of corn and stuff on it. So it's a lovely thing. But yeah, so that kind of sort of sets Cobden up financially.
So in practice, he's drawing money from the business, but not actually working in it to any extent.
And once he gets involved in Corn Law Repeal, that's absolutely right.
What about his private life? Did they have a wife? Did they have children? Have a descendants?
Yes, he did. And he married a Welsh woman called Catherine Williams, who'd been at school with one of his sisters in 1841, actually. And it's interesting. I write about this. One thing I'm terrible at doing is forgetting to give a plug to my own books. And there's my book that came out in 2021, which is it's called Celebrities, Heroes and Champions. It's about popular politicians in the first half of the 19th century. And there's actually a chapter on their private lives in that. And Cobden is part of the material. So in 1841, he's still not 100% committed to the Corn Law campaign because he gets married and he goes off on this extended wedding tour, and he's having to reassure his friends when he gets back, yes, I'm still interested in the Corn Laws, don't worry, I've not forgotten about it. And in fact, when they're on their way north, they do a tour in the continent and they come back and then they go to Scotland, and he has to stop off in Glasgow to give anti-Corn Law speeches and stuff on the way up, which must have pleased Catherine no end. So yeah, he does get married and they have children. Sadly, they lose a child in infancy. Again, that interrupts the Corn Law campaign. You're right. He's giving a speech in Bristol, and he comes off stage to hear this dreadful news that his daughter has died, and he has to go back and spend some time with his wife naturally, and then he takes up the cudgels again. But the kind of real tragedy that hits them is their son. Their son is his first child, Dick Cobden, who was born about I can't remember the exact date of his birth now, but he dies in 1857, aged about 15 or 16, And he's away at school in Heidelberg in Germany. And there's this heart-rending scene where Cobden describes coming back to Dunford in Midhurst with the news of this, that he's found out when he's in London. And he walks in with to a scene where his wife is reading out Dick's latest letter to the rest of the family, completely unaware of the tragedy that's about to hit. And this is devastating for her. She goes into a kind of a crisis that she never really properly comes out of, which really comes through in the letters. And Cobden has to spend, he's out of Parliament by 1857. He spends a lot of time looking after her, taking her around. He takes her to North Wales for some months to, see exposure to her native language. And he was a Welsh speaker, and kind of surroundings would, help to perk her up and that sort of thing. So yeah, there's a lot in the letters about all of that sort of stuff.
Okay, we've got another one there. Yeah.
Yes, you mentioned to begin with that it was very important in the international peace movement, based on the idea that international trade may well lead to international peace. You mentioned the American Civil War, you mentioned the Crimean War. I wonder if there's anything else you could say. Were there any practical examples of how he was able to promote peace internationally outside this, or in fact help to prevent conflict in various areas? It's quite interesting that, the ILP was set up in Bradford itself and was committed to something that they described as ethical socialism. There was always a peace and international dimension of this. And I wondered if there was anything lasting. The last point is, I think it might be to do with my hearing. You made an offhand comment that the Peace Museum at Bradford, which started, of course, behind the Wool Exchange, and they've now got new premises at Saltaire, that they were claiming some link with Cobden that I didn't quite hear.
Oh, right, yeah.
Could you tell me about that?
Yeah, I can start with that, because the Peace Museum have a kind of peace trail around Bradford, and they had a leaflet to do with this, and Cobden's statue was on the trail.
Yes.
But I think they in the absence of any other information, they decided that the reason that there was a statue of Cobden in Bradford must have been that he lived and worked there. So that's what they put on the leaflet, which of course is not. It's not true. Yeah, that was all I mentioned. In terms of the peace movement, in the period sort of in the immediate aftermath of the 1848 revolutions, there's a series of peace congresses, as they're called, which are held in major cities across Europe. So there's one in Brussels, Frankfurt, I think, and Paris and Edinburgh. And Cobden attends many of these, and he does quite a lot, I think, as a practical politician, to bring their program down from the kind of highfalutin, language and something that could really have been a talking shop, and focus it on practical measures. So one of the practical measures that he suggested was arbitration for international disputes, which is something that the Labour Party was still advocating for in the 1920s, which again is another sort of echo of Cobden's influence there. It was also to do with getting rid of war loans. So campaigning amongst people in the City of London to not fund foreign governments when they were taking out loans to prosecute war. And this was a big deal in 1849 when the Russians were floating a war loan to finance their putting down of the revolutions in Hungary and Poland. So that was a practical measure, if you like. So in terms of a practical effect, Cobden and Bright obviously, like Canute against the tide in 1854 with the Crimea. And this is one of the things that sort of drives Bright into kind of mental illness and difficulty. So they're very wary after that of standing against a war that's already started, because once a war's already started, nobody listens to people who want peace, basically, at least not for a long time, at least. But they do make some quite telling interventions, particularly in the December of 1861. There is a real danger that Britain and America might end up going to war, because the Americans seize two Confederate envoys who were traveling on a British mail packet to Europe to kind of proselytize for the Confederacy. And there's a huge storm in the British press about this, and there's a lot of saber rattling, and Palmerston sends troops to Canada in case Canada is invaded. And Cobden and Bright both write to Charles Sumner, who's the chair of the American Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and basically explaining the situation in Britain. It's a very febrile situation. The press are pressing for war. We don't really believe the government wants war. So if you make a kind of gesture, if we kind of sort this out, and Bright in particular is pushing an idea of arbitration for this as an example you could use. And in the event, these letters are read out to Lincoln at a crucial kind of cabinet meeting in late December. And partly as a result of that, and partly as a result of other information, they decide to release the two envoys and kind of diffuse the whole situation. So that's seen as a kind of key sort of intervention, if you like. Well, yeah, I don't know if there's any Zoom question. Anything on Zoom?
Just one more thing. I always find it remarkable how these enormous collections of letters are accumulated.
Yeah.
So how was it in this process? Is it?
Well, our letters project was not the first Cobden letters project. The first Cobden letters project was actually by Cobden's daughters. I mentioned the death of their son, Dick Cobden, but actually there were a number of daughters who survived into adulthood, some of whom became very politically active. There was Annie Cobden Sanderson, who became a socialist and a suffragette, and Jane Cobden Unwin, who was a liberal and a suffragist. And there were various other sort of, there were other Cobden daughters who also became involved in public life in different ways. And they came up with the first plan to publish Cobden's correspondence. So they actually sent out a message to all the people they knew their father had been in touch with to send them the letters, which they then dutifully copied out beautifully in copy letter books that are now at the West Sussex Record Office. And then they kind of sent them all back out again. And this is how some of them got lost in the meantime. But the more important collections, or the more political collections, if you like, ended up at the British Library. So that's where, the two main collections of Cobden letters are at the British Library and at West Sussex Record Office. There's also another quite important collection which has a lot of family correspondence and early correspondence, which is in Manchester at the Manchester Archives there. Apart from that, there's the biggest collection apart from those three, I think, is the one at University of California, Los Angeles, which is a bit of a kind of hodgepodge of different things. And also the Welsh National Archive have his correspondence with Henry Richard, who was the chairman or secretary of the Peace Society in the early 1850s, became editor of the Cobdenite Morning Star in the 1860s, and ended up becoming an MP, the MP for Wales, as he was sometimes referred to, after Cobden's death, and a sort of leading Welsh Liberal MP. So there's a big correspondence with him.
So in part, this is people who received his letters and their personal correspondence being collected.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
In terms of Cobden's, the letters that Cobden himself received.
Yes, most of those in West Sussex. There are some in the British Library. A lot of them, of course, get burned. There are heartbreaking letters that he writes in the 1850s. Oh, out in the garden today, burning another sack full of anti-Corn Law correspondence. It's like, oh, damn. But so there's not a lot of in letters from certain periods because he kind of weeded them. My favourite in letter, actually, because it made me hoot with laughter when I read it, was from a pair of women who ran a school near Sheffield, Mary and Rebecca Brady, and they were kind of collectors of radical politicians. They were great friends of William Lloyd Garrison, the American abolitionist, and he stayed with them when he kind of passed through Sheffield, I think. And there's a wonderful letter that they wrote to Cobden, and this is one of the things this is how I got interested in celebrity, you see, by reading Cobden, and by reading about some of the things, gifts people gave him, just because he was who he was, and they wanted this connection with this great person. And it reads, Mary and Rebecca Brady would beg Richard Cobden to accept the gift of a pair of slippers. M&RB regret the fact that the shoemaker should have made them of such a size as to render them almost entirely useless. And I think Cobden probably kept that letter because it made him hoot with laughter as well.
I always find this amusing because I have virtually every letter that I've received or postcard since the age of about 9. And periodically I say to some of my friends, particularly from university, would you like your letters back? And they say, what on earth would we want those for? Family archives, you know.
Absolutely. Thank you. Anyone else? Anyone? Did we have any Zoom?
No, there's nothing on Zoom. No. Okay, well, thank you very much, Simon, for such an interesting talk and for sharing your knowledge and for coming over so clearly and concisely. We've all really enjoyed it. So thank you.